Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us here at the Southwest Center for Human Relations Studies at the University of Oklahoma in Norman. I am Dr. Jenny Rongo. I'm the Executive Director of the Center and the Director of NCOM, and I'm very delighted to host you today. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, NCOR offers 2 webinars per month on the first and on the last Wednesday. However, this October, we are off regular schedule, so the dates and times have changed for our next 2 events. We hope that you can check out our calendar of events at ncor.ou.edu so that you can see the different times and dates for that. On October 13th, that is next week, we shall have 2 experts speak on academic freedom and free speech in the academy, and that will be at 10:30 a.m. Central Daylight Time. So that is a different time from when we offer our webinars, 10:30 a.m. Central Daylight Time for October 13th. October 20th, we shall have the Rehearsals for Life. This is a theater troupe from the University of Oregon, and they shall be facilitating how to manage difficult conversations and dynamics in the classroom. This will be an interactive workshop. Where are you joining us from? Please use the chat box to introduce yourself, give a shout out to your organization or your institution. Let us introduce ourselves that way. Our panelists today are Dr. Michael Carhart and Dr. Stephanie Meyer. Dr. Michael Carhart earned his Ph.D. in the field of higher education with a concentration in education research, assessment, and program evaluation. His research is focused on student collective action in higher education. Specifically, his research attempts to understand the relationship between institutional resource characteristics and Black student organization mobilization. He currently works as an academic advisor for an interdisciplinary major program at Seton Hall University. He has also taught social science courses on perspectives of race, gender, class, and culture as an adjunct at multiple 2- and 4-year institutions. He has published a supplemental text titled Living Sociology, Exercises to Train the Sociological Imagination in 2015, designed to engage beginner students in the discipline of sociology. Dr. Meyer is a recent PhD graduate with a degree in higher education management and policy from Seton Hall. She received her master's in business administration and a bachelor's in business administration with a concentration in accounting and finance and a minor in jazz and African American music. Her background and experience are focused in corporate, nonprofit, utility, and higher education finance. Current research topics include undergraduate student loan debt, graduate school enrollment, and relationships in enrollment and diversity within higher education. Stephanie is currently working at Columbia University as a financial disbursement analyst and an adjunct instructor. We are very, very grateful for their expertise and for them accepting our invitation to come and join us this afternoon. I want to remind everybody that closed captioning is available for this webinar, and CAT is also available. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Carhart and Dr. Stephanie Meyer. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you. All right, welcome to our presentation titled Beyond the Demands, Examining Institutional Characteristics That Predict Black Student Protest Events. I'm Michael Carhart, and as was mentioned, my research focuses on investigating student collective action in higher education and understanding the various ways institutional environments support, harm, and hinder student activists.
And again, I'm Stephanie Meyer. My research focuses on enrollment in graduate school and relations between financial stressors such as tuition and student loans on enrollment.
Before we begin, we want to make a land acknowledgement So the land on which Stephanie and I inhabit is physically situated in the original ancestral homelands of the Munsee and Lenape, and we pay respect to the Munsee and Lenape peoples, past, present, and future, in their continuing presence in the homeland and throughout their historical diaspora. And further, if you'd like to contact Stephanie or I concerning our research, please feel free to send an email to the following email addresses listed here, and we'll provide that information at the end. So I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie right now.
Thank you, Michael. So just a presentation overview. In this presentation, we'll begin by introducing our research topic. This includes our purpose for conducting the research and background into what we saw as a problem to be solved. We will then review our research questions, and then we will highlight current research on protests, on student protests and protest events. We will also provide limitations we observed in the literature. Next, review the conceptual model and identify our implemented theory. Following this, we will provide details regarding our research design, discussing our data sources, variables, and all the different tests conducted on our data set. Next, we provide the results from these tests and highlight major results. And then we provide implementations and review items for discussion based on these results. And finally, provide several recommendations for administrators in future research. One major event that highlighted the need to examine student protests happened at our time actually as graduate students. In 2018 at Seton Hall University, there was a 10-day sit-in at the President's Hall, organized by the Concerned 44. This event provided a feeling of separation on campus between students and staff. During this time, you could feel an energy of frustration and disconnect in the campus environment. The Concerned 44 was named based on the 44% of students at Seton Hall University that were in the minority based on race, color, sexual orientation, or gender identity. The purpose of the Concerned 44 was to address institutional racism on campus. The problem we saw identified activist burnout, institutional environment characteristics, and relationships between Black students and these institutional environment characteristics. Research indicated that Black student activists experience activist burnout as agents of change for their campuses. Yet other research shows that Black activists had positive experiences on their campuses. A technical problem in literature we found, even though studies have investigated experiences of Black student collective action, we do not know as much to how institutional environment characteristics relate to Black student protest events. Additionally, it is important to better understand the relationship as recent Black student protests have happened over issues of racial injustices, microaggressions, toxic campus climates, and continued increases in college costs. We hope it will provide an additional institutional layer to understanding the environment that current studies on campus climate help underscore. The purpose of our research is to test strain theory and utilize a conceptual model to obtain a better understanding of the relationship between institutional environment and Black student protest events. Our research questions are as followed. What institutional factors predict Black student protest events? And what is the distribution across different types of institutions with Black student protest events compared to those without them? The Black Liberation Collective, also known as the BLC, was a major resource for our research. We use this source to assist in identifying institutions with the presence of Black student protest events. The Black Liberation Collective is a national and international student organization active in 2015 and comprised of various formal and informal student organizations that issue demands at their respective campuses, but not all issued demands resulted in campus protests. This collective consisted of Black students dedicated to providing unity within higher education through direct action. Their vision statement is, we envision a world where all Black people have access to higher education within learning spaces that are safe for all Black students. In reviewing literature, there were many empirical studies on student protests conducted in the 1960s and 70s. Researchers were interested in identifying characteristics that were conducive to protests in order to recommend ways to prevent protests. A major difference between these studies and ours is we focus on institutional characteristics and the relationships they had towards Black student protests. In reviewing recent major empirical studies, we focus on strain factors, institutional factors, and student demographic characteristics. Statistically significant strain factors were identified as tuition and student loans. Institutional factors included size, selectivity, and control, identifying private and public institutions. Student demographics characteristics included Black students and Pell Grant recipients. In reviewing limitations, our outcome measures range from student protest demands to campaign, to protest issues, to presence of student democratic society chapters on campus. Few studies examined the relationship between institutional characteristics and student protest events. Not many have looked at student protest events. There is also a lack of quantitative studies conducted. We fill this limitation by using a quantitative approach in our research. Lastly, few studies utilized and tested social movement studies with a theoretical constructs. The theory we tested in our study is strain theory, also identified as grievance theory. This theory assumes that social movements emerge when outside forces reach a tipping point in terms of pressure, pushing social groups into action. Given the campus climate in 2015 and in 2018 with the Concern 44, we hypothesized that institutional environment factors may be associated with stress for Black students who participate in protest events on campus. Our conceptual model tested strain theory. We test this through strain characteristics, which are identified as tuition and student loans. Our strain mechanism shows if there is an increase in financial stress, such as an increase in tuition and student loans, stress will increase on students. We controlled for institutional characteristics, including selectivity, size, and control, and student demographic characteristics, including Black students, gender, and Pell Grant recipients. Now I'll turn it over to Michael for the research design.
Thanks, Steph. For the study, we used secondary data from the Integrated Post-Secondary Data System known as IPEDS. Now, IPEDS collects data from colleges that participate in federal student financial aid programs. Here, we use college to signify 4-year and above institutions. And we also use data from the Black Liberation Collective's webpage. And I'll just call that, hereafter call that the BLC, to construct our dichotomous outcome variable of Black student protests or not. The BLC lists about 86 institutions with Black student protest demands, and we conducted a search with specific parameters to identify Black student protest events on campuses. Out of the 86, 80 institutions contain them. And in terms of our independent variables, we broke them down by strain factors and variables we controlled for in the model, as Stephanie mentioned. For the strain factors, we divided tuition by $1,000 to make the coefficient more comprehensible, because tuition was put into dollars, not by $1,000. So we made it more readable that way. And student loans was measured by as a percent of students awarded student loans. And we constructed dummy variables for institutional size and control. Selectivity was measured as percent of students admitted. And demographic characteristics were percent of undergraduate Black students, women, and Pell Grant recipients. So these were the steps of our data analysis. For data management, we cleaned and conducted a missing data analysis and presented descriptive statistics. For data management, is an essential thing to do for this, because we were missing some cases of data. And we used the various inflation factor, hereafter called the VIF, to diagnose multicollinearity. And also we used the receiver operating characteristic curve analysis for evaluating the accuracy of the statistical model. And we presented an independent t-test to compare institutions with Black student protests versus those without them. And finally, we estimated our binary logistic regression and conducted a sensitivity test based on the results of the VIF values. So as I mentioned before, we needed to diagnose multicollinearity and examine to what extent, if at all, measures are related. So values greater than 5 are taken by statisticians to mean variables are highly correlated and may be a cause for concern. Since the VIF values you see here for control as private not-for-profit and tuition are higher than 5, we conducted the sensitivity test, which we'll go through the results later. But first, let's look at the t-test. So the results here of the t-test, you can begin to see a picture of the higher ed landscape in 2015. And the simple means tests that we use compare averages of institutions with Black student protests on the left there versus those without them on the right. And we reported the averages for these variables as well as the standard deviations. So colleges with Black student protest events on average had higher tuitions, over a $6,000 difference. And also a lower percentage of students were awarded student loans at 46%. They also had a lower percentage of Pell Grant recipients at about 26%. And the 80 colleges were also at more selective institutions with an average acceptance rate of 47%. And they had larger enrollments as well. And likewise, the lion's share of schools without Black student protest events were at smaller colleges. So first we'll present here the full model. These are the results of the full Logit model. And the logistic regression table contains the following info from left to right: the variables, the odds ratio, the significance, and the standard error. Now we underscored and bolded the following variables: tuition, selectivity, and percent of Pell Grant recipients, because these are the primary variables that were altered when we conducted the sensitivity test. And we'll discuss these results in the next slide. So notice that tuition has dropped slightly and selectivity and Pell Grant pick up in statistical significance. So for our strain factor up top there with tuition, a $1,000 increase in tuition was related to a 2.8% increase in the odds of having a Black student protest event. And for selectivity below that, a 1% increase in the acceptance rate was associated with a 2% decrease in the odds of having a Black student protest event. And as you can see with institutional size below there, the three categories, the base group for size were institutions with 20,000 and above enrolled students. So the odds of having a Black student protest event on campus compared with institutions that size lowered by 91.8% for colleges between that 1,000 to 4,999 enrolled students, 87% for colleges with that 5,000 to 9,999 range, and 79% for colleges with the 10,000 to 19,999 range. And below, with student demographic characteristics, a 1% increase in the percent of undergraduate Black students is related to a 4.2% increase in the odds of having a Black student protest event. And finally, for every 1% increase in Pell Grant recipients, the odds of having a protest, Black student protest that is, decreased by 4.3%. And so at this point, what does it mean? I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie to talk a little bit about the theoretical implications here.
All right. Thank you, Mike. So our theoretical implementations, we want to again highlight our hypothesis. Our hypothesis predicted that institutions with strain factors such as higher tuition and more student loan recipients were more likely to contain Black student protest events. Our implications based on our results demonstrated that certain strain characteristics were associated with Black student protest events. This was identified through tuition. Also, not all strain characteristics were identified as factors, for example, student loans. Lastly, there could be other plausible explanations to our study besides just strain mechanisms. Now I'll turn it back to Michael to review our discussion and recommendations.
Thanks. So from this study and others like it, we can clearly see that institutional environments are not neutral things. And the question is, how are students impacted by these non-neutral environments? And from other studies in this literature, especially qualitative studies, Black activists have reported experiencing burnout, fatigue, and simply just wanting to be students on their campuses. And so when we looked at certain strain factors in the environment, that could be a result of some of this dissatisfaction, certainly. So there's a study by Linder et al. And one powerful quote from that study was, a student had said to that researcher, students should have the privilege of just simply being students. But there are some students who can't just be a student. Additionally, it seems also from the literature that institutions are gatekeepers of social income privilege, that on the one hand, and in racist environments on the other. And it also appears that institutions are in some way protecting themselves here. And so if environments tend to protect themselves at the cost of student health and well-being, from some of these studies here, then where does that leave the best interest of students, particularly Black students? So by doing a study like this, a quantitative study, we hope that investigating these institutional environments where people sometimes view them as neutral, we can show, in fact, they do things to folks that are in these environments, and lend further assistance and support to the severity and the demands and experiences of Black students that were protesting at these institutions. I mean, we believe the work of dismantling oppressive environments should be initiated by administrators, faculty, and staff, and not necessarily from the students themselves alone, which sometimes that's what it seems to be like. And this is especially the case if higher education institutions are wanting to foster inclusive and diverse environments at their institutions. And what would we recommend in terms of policy practice and future studies? So first, future studies could investigate the perception of administrators, leaders, and decision makers on institutional racism in oppressive environments. And first, we would want to know some questions like how do they view student collective action, and how specifically do they view Black student activism? And in terms of diversity training programs, researchers could investigate the effectiveness of diversity training programs that administrators and faculty are required to take. Are they becoming agents of change at their institutions? Furthermore, administrators themselves and faculty could evaluate the effectiveness of programs intended to foster equity and inclusion. Are they increasing amelioration of toxic environments? Are they, helping those environments be a little bit more inclusive? And finally, researchers, faculty, and administrators could survey students at predominantly white institutions, PWIs, to examine to what extent students experience racial battle fatigue on their campuses. And so Smith, Allen, and Danley and have defined racial battle fatigue as physiological and psychological strain exacted on racially marginalized groups, and the amount of energy spent dedicated to coping with racial microaggressions and racism. And so institutions could provide resources specifically to institutional research and diversity, equity, inclusion officers to collect data and provide strategic plans on ways that we can ameliorate this environment. And gaining the perspectives of students in this area would help us better understand these oppressive environments and ways we could move forward with this. Okay, and finally, we would be happy to answer any questions you have in the box.
Thank you so much, Michael and Stephanie. And I welcome everyone to putting their questions in the Q&A, but I'll get this show started. You did mention about strain in the environment. Can you paraphrase that? Besides the tuition, what are some of those other strains in the environment that Black students experience, pushing them into protest or into requesting or demanding for change? And I welcome others to list in the chat if you have an understanding of this conversation. I think that would be helpful.
Stephanie, you want me to answer or you? Okay. Well, I mean, from this protest year in 2015, I mean, students were commenting, and especially on the movements in 2014 with the I2M Harvard campaigns and other campaigns that came out of that movement. students were talking about microaggressions experienced daily, and talking specifically about these experiences on their campuses. And we just thought we would take a broad view of possibly saying, okay, well, may it be that I guess a more selective institution could in some fact be causing strain, or the size of the institution could be causing strain. And these are just essentially stressors in the environment that could push students in the action. But we can't, when we test this theory, there's limitations on it because our strain factors were more money, more loans. That would be the motivator to push. And we found that there are other factors that we controlled for that seem to, environmental factors that seem to have more of an impact. And we could postulate, in fact, that those are stressors, but we'd be reaching a little bit. I hope that somewhat answers it.
Stephanie, do you want to add on to that?
So I agree with Michael on a lot of these. When it comes to the institution, it really varies on, we're looking at another thing we're looking at is location. So based on the community around the school too, could cause a lot of stress and strain on the students, based on environments, and also comparing to where students were raised based off of where they're going to college. There are a lot of studies based on the diversity of the student in terms of that transition into college. So there are studies that did observe how students transition in based on their location. And there's strain and stress just on that alone. Not only just for a regular, even, forget race and gender, just a student transitioning into a physical location that's different from where they've been causes strain and stress. But also for certain students, for example, we're using Black students, but students that come from areas that not a lot of students in that environment on campuses came from, causes stress for them to connect onto campus with other students.
So what have been your experiences in your campus in Seton Hall? How did your institution try to dismantle some of these strains? So what support systems were put in place? You may be helping somebody in this call, maybe think about doing the same. And we can welcome everyone to share in the chat what they are doing in their institutions to make sure that the environments in our institutions are welcoming for our Black students, but also for other students who may be feeling this strain or racial battle fatigue.
I mean, I could answer from an administrative standpoint here, because I did some qualitative work on preliminary work with leaders of the concerned, administrators that led the charge with negotiating with the Concerned 44, so to speak, the protest group we mentioned. And this is a small Catholic institution, and this is a strange place to see a protest. First off, there's not many protests that happen in a smaller place. As we saw with the data on the Ttest, really small institutions, you don't, especially like a Catholic institution, you don't see a lot of that protest happen. But they were really unequipped to respond to it, and in some ways didn't really understand where students were coming from. But they were more than willing to say that they have a diverse environment. But they're now trying to build a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee that exists now that sort of recognizes differences, and they are trying to do promotion, but it was butting heads for a while, and those students were very disappointed when the leader said, if you want an Africana Studies program, go to Harvard, and because it was a defunct program that students said we wanted it. And so we had a lot of changes in power. So we've got a new president now, and we'll see where that lands. But it was a rough go over here. I wouldn't use this institution as a beacon of hope. But hopefully, we've got new people on board and folks that are younger and more diverse on staff that may be able to have a voice to bring this into where it needs to go.
First off, I think telling students to go to another institution, that is truly unfortunate. Is that what you mean by institutions trying to protect themselves?
Yes. I mean, one of the interesting things too about what we've seen in the research is, yeah, students are protesting against the institution that these people work at. And there's some defensiveness already about that at some of these places, that they're basically saying, listen, you're harming me, you need to change. And institutions are slow things. They're slow animals to move and change, and they get defensive. And sometimes, yeah, go somewhere else. And people are having meetings all the time and run down and overworking and simply just not their best selves. So we do see institutions have that level of protection, and then also too glorifying it and taking the work that student activists, particularly in this case, Black student activists at this institution, did a lot of legwork for this movement, and they're not really recognized for their work. It's unpaid labor. It's work that maybe some of the students that I talk to in this movement, they just simply want to go to class. They want to just make some social connections like other students, worry about their careers. And so there's that part of activism that I think is not so lovely, where students are like, I've got to do this because no one else is going to do it. My administrators are not doing anything. So I need to miss class to do this for the future. And maybe I just want to go to class, which I find to be is an interesting facet of activism, because it does bring change, but as I mentioned, what cost?
Stephanie, do you want to add anything to that before I read one of the questions we have from Claudette?
No, I think Michael explained it very well. Thank you. Okay.
So Claudette is asking, what happens when it is environmental? For example, an entire group of BIPOC students was sent an email telling them nobody wants you at this college. How do you help the students to adjust to this? Evidently, this happened at UMass. So somebody's writing an email to us, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and telling them nobody wants you here. How do you deal with that? And I know you may not have explored that in your study, but I'm sure when you're doing your review and readings for this, you may have come across that.
Mike, I can take this one for you. So I know it has to always come from the top. I hate to say that, but it has to show leadership has to do something first. So a letter from the president describing the culture and what they set the culture of the campus to be. And I think it's realistic for the president to just be honest and say, hey, we can't really control things like this, but I'm going to let you know we don't stand for this. So having leadership really step in and just tell them, hey, we stand with, whatever, I hope the campus doesn't stand for agreeing with the email, but we, having the president reassure and reiterate what diversity and inclusion means to the school, what the campus ideals are, what they believe in, and how they want their student environment to be. I know from my experience working at multiple institutions, there actually sadly were cases like this as well, where a lot of this happened during, I hate to say during the Trump presidency, a lot of more racial injustices were happening. A lot of people were a little bit more vocal about how they felt about certain races, genders, and other protected identities. And what really assured students, from those students that were a little I would say rude and to them directly was having not only just the president, but staff and other faculty support against that type of behavior on campus.
So I think it's a good idea for the president to send an email or to send a letter of support, but I have been in situations where that is not enough. So I would hope that whatever institutions we are from, that folks can actually come up with tangible action steps to support our students. I want to go back to something that you mentioned in your study, and I want maybe a little bit of paraphrasing so that we can understand how that is connecting to the demands, and that is selectivity and institutional size. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So start with size. I mean, one of the things that we thought, as we didn't have enough time to talk about it, but a plausible explanation for size being such a, and by the way, you might have thought it was strange to break size down into those categories, those 4 categories, with the comparison group being 20,000 and above. But in my understanding of this, of activist literature, it's nice to break size down a little bit so you can see the differences there. And obviously, as the sizes are smaller, it becomes less likely that there'll be a protest. And so one way you could possibly explain that is, you know, it could be a situation of critical mass where there's certain number of students on these larger campuses get together from many like-minded folks, or even just simply larger institutions being having more resources and more funding and organizations so students can mobilize. There could be other possible explanations for that. I mean, with the strain explanation, if we, again, we didn't test, we controlled for that, but if we were to put our strain hat on, we could say that, you know, the larger number of people that are stressed on a given place may be the more likely to protest, because now we don't have just a small number of folks that are isolated on a smaller campus. Maybe they're commuters, maybe they're just not really living on campus. Maybe these larger places, they're resident, they're talking, they're communicating about their experiences, and then they're stressed about microaggressions they're experiencing and thus mobilizing. That could be one thing. And with selectivity, which is a measure of prestige in some cases, it's that obviously if you let more, this is the thing, if you let more students in, protest decreases. What does that mean? In my other study, when I was looking at student organizations that mobilize, I thought that it might have been a social income issue, that students have more resources or come from wealthier backgrounds. And that was not a new thing that someone postulated, but it was, okay, so why are these selective institutions? And then it could be the fact that these selective institutions have a lot of money, and the students that come on these campuses that can live among the campuses, they just have a lot of time, they have a lot of resources at their fingertips that they may not have at, let's say, a place like Seton Hall that doesn't have much in way of even a Black student union, I don't think exists. Things of that nature could be why these size and selectivity seem to keep showing up as important in these studies.
So going back to the money issue, and I noticed you had something about Pell Grants. So are you saying the more money an institution has, probably there is a probability that we won't have as many protests because the students' needs are covered? What is the conversation around Pell Grant and money and protest?
Yeah, Pell Grant, that's a tricky one. I've grappled with that in terms of class privilege.
Exactly.
I in my other study, I did that, but then I kind of stepped back with this one. We were just looking at strain factors of tuition and loans and controlling for it as a factor. But when we saw it again pop up, that you increase the number of Pell Grant recipients, you decrease Black student protest events. It's difficult to, because that was, if that's a measure of like social income, we would definitely need to see, we would like to get our hands on data that gave us a more, like, we'd like to take a look at social class as a factor and just have Pell Grant as a measure there. We would need more to really take a look at if this is indeed the case. But yeah, I mean, we could see that, I would hate for an administrator to see this and listen to this and say, oh, well, all I got to do is make sure less Pell Grant people come on campus and then I get less Black student protests. That's not really what we want to say with that, but we want folks to be aware of that. Maybe there is a measure of privilege there, but that's not a bad thing either. I think Richard Blissett and Dominique Baker talked about that with the results of their study. They'd said something along the lines of people would take that. Let's say these students are privileged in some capacity, income privilege, and they protest, but they're still experiencing racism. And so it doesn't take away, even if we're talking about folks that are mobilizing that are a little bit wealthier, it doesn't take away their experience. That it doesn't matter about what kind of class privilege you have, if you're still experiencing microaggressions and racism on campus, it's still a bad thing. We just point out, okay, well, maybe student voice is not represented here. And we can highlight that and underscore that.
So I like a question that Veronica has posted there. Does the research show anything around how campus policies around demonstrations are experienced as a strain factor? And you mentioned something about Seton Hall had not seen protests in that way, so maybe they didn't have policies around that. But so what did you see in your research about campus policies around demonstrations?
It's always one paragraph. It's literally, yeah, in Seton Hall, they just cobbled it together because they didn't really have a policy. So when and that was an interesting thing on our campus, is just putting on a personal experience here. Students did a 10-day sit-in at President's Hall, and basically there was no policy for demonstrations and protests, and they had to try to fast track some type of institutional policy, and they were working hard to basically try to get those students out of there. And they were on the defense with that because there was nothing. But now, if you look at the policy, it's massively strict, and you can't really do that sit-in anymore. But they went through, and certainly policies on protests are fascinating because there's not a lot, and it is reactionary. Something happens and then they'll just cobble something into the policy really quickly, that you'll just say, oh, what was that about? Yeah, I thought about doing topic modeling on a study on that, dealing with the sort of what we see and just putting a bunch of documents together of all of these sort of policies from all these institutions, and then just seeing what important findings I can see from that. I think research should be done in that area for sure.
I think so, and I think what Claudette is mentioning on the chat there, and I'll come to you, Bridget, but I want to mention about what Claudette is mentioning about first generation college students, because most of folks who are first generation also may be on Pell Grant. may also have less money. Did your research capture this at all, or maybe this is something that would be good for future study?
So yeah, we didn't focus, we were only focused on Black students. So we didn't focus on first generation, but it'd be very great to see. And I know Mike and I were discussing that when we were graduate students actually writing this paper, and we were thinking about, it was actually brought up as a recommendation to maybe look into first generation students. It would be great to do it 100%. I know we were thinking it was the data though is kind of hard to manipulate to see if they were on campus during the time frame that you want to study. But it'd be great if someone could figure it out and do a great study on that.
I don't know if iPads contains that variable, does it, Stephanie? Do you
Does
know?
not. No, it's just the percent of first generation, not the number. Yeah.
So I think it would be great for institutions to capture who is first generation and who is not. I think that would be a great community to look at so that if there are any issues there in terms of whether it's funding or it's support systems, then they are addressed. And talking of support systems for Black students and other students of color, Bridget, you have a comment there. Unfortunately, a lot of this change support seems it has to be grassroots or student faculty led. One of our Black faculty members, our only one actually, oh, they have only one, at our small private OT program in Oregon, started a Black students group for Black students who have community and feel supported. Our student organization is currently working on establishing more student supports and processes for concerns. I think that is critical for every institution, whether it's a huge, large research one, or whether it's a small, private, whether it's any kind of institution, support systems are important. Building community for these students are important. The fact that you say you don't have a Black Students Union at Seton Hall, I think that's something you need to look into. These unions are for folks to build community, to just come together and share, be themselves, and show up the way they want to show up. So I hope that every institution would think about building support systems for these students. There's another comment here from Veronica. On the private Catholic campus I worked at in 2015, the administrators scrambled to revise policy, which then was experienced to be anti-Black and only heightened tensions. So what we are saying there, and I would like your comment, is these policies that are being created on the go, on the fly, sometimes they make things worse. So we need to be thinking ahead of time about what are those policies around that. Do you have any comments on that?
I just have to, so I worked at, not only did I work at Seton Hall, but I also worked at St. Thomas Aquinas College. And it's interesting to see that private Catholic, the views and values, they tend to just not want to change. And I hate to say, like, get with the times, we like to say, because we're seeing a lot of just if it isn't broke, don't fix, you don't have to fix it. So a lot of these institutions are kind of just copying and pasting what they see from other institutions and moving on because they don't have experts in those type of topics. And we're seeing, I would say more recently, and when I was at my time at St. Thomas Aquinas College, they hired a diversity inclusion officer because of these issues and because they saw the change in the student population as well, changing for the school. They also started a social justice committee too. So the social justice committee is a combination of, what's going on in the campus and what's going on in the world. And they also not only added just, this was during George Floyd and a lot of issues with police and brutality, and also the issue with our alien and non-residential students on campus. They felt they needed an environment as well to kind of speak to. And the school did a really great job, because not only was it just students, but faculty and staff came to those meetings. So they would have one meeting once a month with the whole campus community. And then on a bi-weekly basis, they would have meetings just with students. And events were happening also with that. But the school's doing a really great job to correct the action that was done in the past. But from my experience with Catholic institutions, you're seeing a lot of those policies just kind of, either they don't have it at all because they never had to experience it, or they didn't have leadership that understood the value of having something like that, or they just, they're not educated enough to understand that it was needed.
I would like to hear probably from our attendees by writing in the chat, what have they done in their institutions to improve these environments, campus climate, support systems for students of color or Black students are included in that. Anyone wants to put something in the chat, I can read it. But I also want to come back to our presenters. You talked about further research. In your further research or research that could be looked into, what is at the top of that list that you really think would be helpful in this situation?
I could say that I certainly do want to see some research, because as somebody who's an administrator, you are required to take diversity training. And I am not 100% sure how effective it is. And I would certainly, that's at the list, if we're talking about environments here that can be harmful to students, I would certainly like to see to what extent these programs are effective. Are they having some type of impact on folks that do them? That is one. And I do focus my attention on administrators a lot, because I think the onus is on them to really do the work and educate themselves. And it's definitely mentioned about it has to happen at the top. I really would love to see a level of commitment from staff and administrators around this. And I don't think I see it. I mean, I see training going on, but I'm not sure whether folks are committed. And it's just an abstract concept that we say. So I would really love to do work on administrators and pick their brains, how they're understanding this. When they see something like happen out of the blue, really, this Concern 44 on our campus, what do they think? How do they respond to Black activists? And because a lot of those folks are in these positions to make these major decisions, sitting on these committees, and I'm not 100% sure that they're invested. Well, like, although they say they may be. So that's really where I see some of the future studies that can certainly be done.
I think that's a very important point, that leadership, administrators, faculty, and staff need to be invested, other than just writing the statements and providing the training. Yes, training is good, but I like your observation, Michael. Are these trainings accomplishing what we want them to accomplish? A change of campus culture, change of attitudes. So that is a good observation. Tiana Okonkwo mentions that they do have a variety of affinity groups to provide support. Do you have anything to speak to that? Affinity groups are a support system, and I hope that folks can establish those, or employee resource groups. I think those are important. Maybe one more question before we summarize. Somebody is asking, in our case, faculty have been the last to come on board to talk about race and racism. Staff and administrators have engaged in workshops, while faculty have yet to be engaged. What are your thoughts about engaging faculty? Very, very good question. Because we always see it's always about students and staff, but faculty are always like, I'm going to class, I'm teaching. So can you speak to, faculty as part of the team that need to buy into this and change the culture?
So I think I kind of discussed it earlier too, about how at St. Thomas Aquinas, they included the faculty and staff, and you notice a huge difference in just the environment as well. It would be great to see a lot of other campuses do that. It not only just, it makes students feel like, oh, it's not just me speaking to the whoever faculty leader for that group, but it's a community group effort for the whole campus to do this. And to see your professor in that, and from my experience at St. Thomas, students would even say, it was awesome to see my professor in a meeting with me outside of class. And it felt like I was in a community with the campus. It didn't feel like a separation of professors, students, faculty, and whatever activities you want to do after class. It was, we're all in this together. We're here to support you as a student and make sure you have the best student experience. So I think it's very major to have professors there, faculty, even faculty, so that if you go to like the financial aid office, a lot of students go there, registrar's office, you're familiar with those faces as well. So you feel like you're in a community with everybody. So I think it's very major to have them, not just, like Michael said, not just click on the boxes and do trainings, but also see the change in the campus as well. So they are part of that community on campus.
Agreed. Not just leaving it to the students themselves or the staff or the advisors that we work with. That is a good observation. I want to read another observation from Harper College, from I think that's Bentley. At Harper College, the Black Student Union, BSU, received support from BIPOC faculty and staff as they developed a list of institutional demands. An anti-racist coalition of faculty and staff then put together their own list of demands, largely reflecting BSU's concerns. One tangible result has been the creation of a social justice studies graduate distinction. I like that they have integrated this into an actual academic program. So not just speaking about it, but actually providing something tangible, whether that is through curriculum changes, new programming. But sometimes we only do cultural programming and we forget that curriculum can offer can offer a lot of learning. So I like what Harper College has done. So any final thoughts on this as we close? What are your next steps in your research? What should we be looking forward to? What do you want us all to start reading so that we can better support our Black and other students of color?
Well, we have more work to do on this project because we were actually, I said to you that, and when we presented that we were looking at the Black Liberation Collective, which was an international student organization, to sort of guide our outcome variable. But Stephanie and I have talked, and 2015 was a big year, and we had thought that we would not just stick with the Black Liberation Collective, and just we would begin a search on that year to see what other types of institutions had protests, Black student protests, and sort of expand the number of our outcome variable. That was one thing we wanted to do because, again, 80 cases for your outcome variable is very small. And hopefully, 2015 was a big year. In fact, people have noted that it was just as big, if not bigger, than the 60s and 70s protests. It was massive. It was a large-scale protest all over higher education. So there are protests that were not reported on the BLC because they had a lot of those selective institutions, as you saw there. But what about those non-selective or smaller institutions that they may have had a protest that the media didn't report or the BLC didn't report it? And we want to include their voice into this as well.
I think I would want to see a study where from 2015 to now, tracking, who was in the protest, what did they demand, what has come from the protest in terms of change. I haven't seen any study of that kind, but I think that would be very helpful to see what has been changed over time. And sharing across institutions and across practitioners. Stephanie, any final word?
Yeah, I was going to also mention this. We were talking about this too. I know a lot of just racial injustice was happening during, I would say, around 2019 to 2020. And it'd be interesting to see how COVID kind of made protests, since most of the schools were remote, to see if how schools kind of adjusted to supporting students online, and if that actually made a difference, and if protests were still happening. I mean, obviously you saw around the world, we were still able to protest on a national basis, and international basis as well during George Floyd. But it would be interesting to see on the campus how students protested, if they actually were on campus protesting during that time, or did they do some online things. So I know the world is changing, as we see right now, is becoming more and more remote. So to see the change in remote protesting too, how to measure that, and how institutions are supporting students on a remote basis.
Well, thank you so very much. I want to thank Dr. Michael Carhart and Dr. Stephanie Meyer. If you would join me in dropping a thank you. Thank you so very much to both of you for this really good conversation. And I really look forward to seeing what you produce here in the near future. Thank you so very much. So on behalf of the Anchor organization here at the University of Oklahoma in Norman, I want to thank everybody for joining us. I want to remind you all that the call for presentations for Anchor 2022 that is going to happen in Portland, Oregon, May 31st to June 4th. The call is out. If you could submit your proposal, that would be wonderful. We look forward to continued webinars, and we also look forward to seeing you in Portland in 2022 in person. Thank you all so very much, and have a good afternoon.